The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question for the United States is what's in our national interest.
My name is John, and the International Criminal Court is now in session. It is October 7, 2025, and we are once again going to look at the situation within Ukraine. So, let's start. First of all, we are going to talk about the Dnipropetrovsk and eastern Zaporozhye direction, in which the Russians have recorded a good chunk of advances here as of late. The Russians themselves, within Dnipropetrovsk, have continued their advances towards the town of Pokrovsky, and reportedly they have begun contesting for the village of Oleksivka. But in response, however, the armed forces of Ukraine have begun their counteroffensive in order to stabilize or to stop the Russians entirely from taking the city or the town of Pokrovsky. Deep State UA has claimed that the Russians have been kicked out from the village of Sosnovka and Novoselivka, along with Koroshe. But there is not enough evidence, however, to support these claims. And while things are interesting right now in the Dnipropetrovsk direction, things are looking a little more interesting in the southern direction. The Russians have recently reported advanced, further westward towards the town of Guleipol, and the results are already showing. The Russians have captured recently the village of Novovasilivsky and have already begun fighting for the village of Poltavka. Should the Russians take Poltavka, along with Uspinovka here up north, they will have no problems whatsoever reaching and perhaps putting the Ukrainians in a cauldron within the city of Guleipol, or town that is. It's up to you on what a city or town is, but you get my point. So yeah, once this entire strip of villages and towns here falls to the Russians, then they will have no issues whatsoever reaching Guleipol. And once this area is taken, then Orkiv will likely be next on the chopping block. And it probably won't be long before that town falls too, considering the fact that they're basically, connected, a tree. Orkiv is, one side of the tree, Guleipol is on the other side of the tree, but once you basically cut one branch of that tree down, then it gets easier to, reach that other part of the tree, but also it makes the tree a little more useless. And of course, I am talking about the Ukrainians' defensive line here within the Zaporozhye region, which is now pretty much useless because the Russians have breached it a long time ago, thanks to their successes in the Dnipropetrovsk region. It's also in turn going to make an assault on the city of Zaporozhye, which is the provincial capital of the region that it's named after or is named for, much easier. And now, going a little further east, the Russians have continued their offensive into the village of Ivanovka, which is in the direction of Novopavlovka within Dnipropetrovsk. The Russians, according to Divjin, which is a pro-RU source, have claimed that the Russians have put more of Ivanovka into a gray zone. But I honestly would prefer people to be cautious about this area at this time, though it is kind of likely, knowing how poor the Ukrainians are performing at this time, it is highly likely that the news is true, but I would prefer, however, to take the news from Divjin with a grain of salt. But once Ivanovka falls to the Russians, then we can pretty much put a fork in the Novopavlovka coffin. And then looking at the situation within the city of Pokrovsk, the news is not good for the armed forces of Ukraine. If anything, it is a nightmare brewing for them. To start off, the TO-406 road, which goes from Pokrovsk all the way up to Mizova in Dnipropetrovsk region, is now under physical Russian control, not just with FPV drones, but also with physical Russian troops and vehicles. The road going from Udachny to Pokrovsk was captured recently by the Russians in the last couple of days when I was in Chicago, and I should now also mention that more and more of Pokrovsk itself is coming under Russian control. And to explain what's going on, I'll break it down for you. The southern neighborhoods of the city of Pokrovsk, these large commie blocks here, these micro-districts here, it's around 3 to 4 or so neighborhoods here. I'm sorry if I said here multiple times, but again, you get what I'm saying here, have come under Russian control. And reportedly, according to various pro-Russian sources, the entirety of the southern part of Pokrovsk is already under Russian control. And after, of course, the conquering of these areas here, the Russians have already consolidated and have started advancing into the lower-rise private residency areas in Pokrovsk. And because of that, it's going to put the central part of the city in a cauldron, with the Ukrainians having no way out of there. And reportedly, according to Mosno, who is a Ukrainian living in the Sumy region, it appears that the armed forces of Ukraine are already getting ready to evacuate from both the cities of Pokrovsk and Mayanograd. And if this news is to be confirmed, then the Russians will have essentially no issues breaching Dnipropetrovsk from the northeast, and in addition, will have no issues whatsoever continuing their offensive in the Dobropila direction. And speaking of Pokrovsk, the Russians have reportedly taken the entirety of the western part of the city and have already breached its northern areas, or northern neighborhoods. The industrial area here, which connects both the E50 road and this road going all the way to Konstantinovka here, has now been completely cut off by the Russians with FPV drones. But it's only a matter of time before the Russians not only cross the railroad here, but it also seems only a matter of time before they take control of the E50 road within this industrial zone. And apparently things are getting so bad for the armed forces of Ukraine as of late that the Russians seem to be advancing within this part of the city of Pokrovsk without much of an issue. And it seems only a matter of time before the main part of the city comes under Russian control. So I guess we can give it maybe 1 to 2 weeks at the current pacing. But time will tell, of course, if this remains to be the case, because the Ukrainians have shown time and time again that they refuse to let go of an area for a long period of time, even if it's obvious that at some point whatsoever that they're going to lose it anyway. And also, in addition, in the Mayanograd area, the Russians have continued their advances in this direction. And according to Lost Armor and Divgen, everything here adjacent to the city of Mayanograd has already been taken by the Russians, though I do believe and do agree with Syriac maps that it's all in a gray zone. Though it won't surprise me if, of course, this all comes under quick Russian control, especially with the news speculating, of course, from Mosno that they could be withdrawing, in mass, that is. So yeah, Mayanograd and Pokrovsk are in a massive cauldron, and it's shaping to be a huge disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine. And things are also getting worse, by the way, because in the Dobropila direction, according to Syriac maps, now personally, I would put this entire area in a gray zone, but that's just me. But because we're playing by Syriac's rules here, let's try to explain what's going on. And also try to presume that a lot of this is true. The village of Nikanorivka is now back under full Russian control again after a Ukrainian counteroffensive there failed. And in addition, Novi Shakove has been captured by the Ukrainians too, though I honestly don't think that this is true at all. Valnay is also reportedly captured by the Russians after basically a long series of clashes there, and it also now seems that the Ukrainian counteroffensive to take Novotoretsky, Pankovka, and Mayak have also failed. And also the Russians appear to have re-entered the town or village of Lodomarivka. And Russians are also reportedly advancing on Sofivka as well. So if the Russians are able to cut off this road here, this entire area, consisting of Turetsky, Sofivka, Shakove, and Volodymyrivka, will not only be put in a cauldron, but it will be obvious to many that it will be ripe for a quick Russian takeover. Thus, the Dobropila offensive will be back in full swing, and it will be nothing but bad news for the Ukrainians, especially for those in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And speaking of which, the Russians have taken complete control over the village of Klibambuk, which is located in the Konstantinovka direction, and they have also started contesting for the village of Plishivka. And in addition, Russians have also taken more ground outside of the city of Konstantinovka and have continued clearing this pocket here. But, however, if you ask for my opinion on the matter, I think the Ukrainians have left this area a long time ago, and it's just that the Ukrainian government in Kiev does not want to admit more defeats. In the Chasiv Yar direction, no changes. But in Siversk, we got a lot of things going on here. So as all of you know by now, Fedorivka is under Russian control, along with the village of Kuzminivka. And also, Vimka is back under full Russian control, and it all seems but inevitable that the Russians are going to enter the town of Siversk itself. For real this time. Not like with some DRGs and such, but with the actual Russian army. 3 years after failures by the Russian army to reach Siversk, it seems that they have now finally are on the brink of taking this town. And if they're able to take Siversk, then Liman is just basically a stone's throw away from being taken as well. Or in this case, recaptured. The situation for the Ukrainians has stabilized in Yampol for now, but overall though in the Liman direction, things are not looking good for them here either. The Russians are advancing on the village of Stavki, and there is a report that Mayern, which is this little fishing village here, has been taken by the Russians too after the Ukrainians withdrew from it. Novoselivka is contested by the Russians, along with the outskirts of Drobshivi as well. And now going north to the Kupiansk direction. This is huge. The Russians, after the last month or two of fighting for the outskirts, like the northern and western outskirts of Kupiansk, have not only broken completely into the city, but they are now on the brink of taking it over entirely. The Russians have reportedly taken full control over the city center of Kupiansk, including the central Rada building here and the main city square. And also, the main commie blocks have reportedly come under full Russian control here too, though Syriac has not admitted to this happening at this time. But the Institute for the Study of War, which is a neoconservative source, has claimed that the Russians have in fact taken the commie blocks within Kupiansk. And in addition, it also seems pretty likely at this point that these commie blocks here within the southwestern outskirts of Kupiansk have also been seized too by the Russians. And as you can see here, pretty much every single road going in and out of the city is now cut off by the Russian army, and the Ukrainians that are still in the city center itself is now in a complete cauldron. And in addition, pretty much all these guys here are now in a cauldron too, because there is no reliable way out of the city of Kupiansk. And once the Ukrainians are able to evacuate, well, if they're able to, that is, from this pocket here, then everything here will be recaptured by the Russians for the first time since 2022. And also, it will give the Russians, for the first time too, the ability to establish themselves an alternative government to the, regional government within the city of Kharkiv. The Russians are definitely going to reestablish the Kharkiv military civil administration very soon, once Kupiansk is recaptured. And we can also expect throughout the year of 2026 for the Russians to try to reverse everything they lost within the Kharkiv region itself. And speaking of the Kharkiv region, the Russians have continued to seize the initiative within the city of Volchansk. They have continued taking more and more of the western part of the town of Volchansk, and there's even reports here that this area is now under Russian control too. And if this were to be true, then it's only a matter of time before Volchansk joins its brother within Kupiansk. So, with that being said, we can expect the Russians to try to reverse everything they lost 3 years ago. And now with more manpower and funds, and of course ammunition to back them up, it's pretty likely that any future Ukrainian counteroffensive within the Kharkov region will not succeed. It is highly unlikely, especially that the Ukrainians have lost so many soldiers fighting it out for not only Donetsk and Lugansk regions, but for the Zaporozhye region as well. We can expect Volchansk, Veliki Berlik, Kupyansk, Balaklaya, Izium, and yes, even Chuagiv to be on the chopping block, not just in 2025, but in 2026. And lastly, before we wrap up today's video, the Ukrainians have continued their offensive or counteroffensive that is, in the Sumy region, and have reportedly advanced into the southern part of Oleksivka. But Syriac, though, has not confirmed any of these reports. And with that, my friends, that is going to do it for today's video. And before I get going, I want to apologize, of course, if it's been a while, because I was in Chicago for a bit for family matters, that is. And also, I am very aware of Tomahawk missiles being considered for delivery to Ukraine. if you ask for my opinion on what I think of the Tomahawks being deployed there, I personally think it is an act of desperation by Donald Trump himself to stop the Russian advances in eastern Ukraine. Because everybody knows that during October and perhaps November 2025, this fall, and I guess maybe winter, is going to be a huge nightmare. A disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine. A disaster so bad that not even the Western media will be able to hide it. Not just from the Ukrainian people, but from the hardcore Ukrainian supporters in the West. It seems like it's not only an act of desperation to stop them from winning the war, but it also seems like he's trying to save his own tainted legacy, which has already been ruined at this point, since probably January 6, 2021. And also, all these refinery strikes that the Ukrainians and their supporters keep gloating about, again, I think it's all a desperate attempt to try to get Russian society to stand up to a government that they really have no desire in overthrowing. There's literally no desire at all. And even if they were to be plunged into darkness for the next few months or so, it still will not be enough to stop the Russian advances in eastern and southern Ukraine. So yeah, that's going to do it for today's video, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed it and found it informative, and I will see you all again in 3 days. So take care, everyone, and peace out. Bye-bye.